All right, we're recording. I do believe this is like episode 57 or 58. This is Just This by Richard Rohr. And if you're watching this as part of the archive recording, you are more than welcome to join us live at 6:30 Pacific Standard Time. And all the information you need and the links you need are in the comments section if you would ever like to join us live. We'd love to have you. But feel free to lurk and watch us in recorded mode. That also works too. Glad to have you. Okay, we're going to be starting on page 84 tonight. Hope and suffering, which immediately follows necessary suffering. So remember, this whole section is about suffering, suffering and surrender. So we're getting our fill of suffering. So hope you guys are still feeling hopeful about all the suffering that's being thrown at you every Wednesday night. But we're going to put the most positive spin that we can on the suffering. So there you go. All right. Oh, I guess I should ask if there's any old business before we jump in. Anything from last week? Anything over the week that you wanted to bring up? Going once, going twice, going thrice. Okay, let's dive in on page 84. The virtue of hope, with great irony, is the fruit of a learned capacity to suffer wisely, calmly, and generously. The ego demands successes to survive. The soul needs only meaning to thrive. Somehow, hope provides its own kind of meaning in a most mysterious way. The gospel gives our suffering both personal and cosmic meaning by connecting our pain to the pain of others, and finally by connecting us to the very pain of God. Did you ever think of God as suffering? Most people don't, but Jesus came to change all of that. Any form of contemplation is a gradual sinking into this divine fullness where hope lives. Contemplation is living in a unified field that produces in people a deep, largely non rational, and yet calmly certain hope, which is always a surprise. A life of inner union, a contemplative life, is practicing for heaven now. God allows us to bring on earth what is in heaven. Every time we can allow, receive, and forgive the conflicts of the moment and can sit in some degree of contentment, despite all the warring evidence. God alone, it seems to me, can hold together all the seeming opposites and contradictions of life. And with God, we can actually do the same. But we are not the doer. Okay, this one gets a little deep, huh? A few sentences there that are probably going to hold our attention for a while tonight. Any initial concepts, reactions, anything jump out at you?
For me, it's the contemplation is living in a unified field that produces in people a deep, largely non-rational yet calmly certain hope, which is always a surprise. That seems counterintuitive, but I know, like for me, as I've been going through this process, that um, there is this unify. I feel like I am getting unified, and interesting. When I first start connecting with this, is the it was for a while. I felt like two people, like because I have anxiety, and so like if I'm walking across a bridge or go somewhere real high, it feels like somebody wants to push me off the building or push me off the bridge. And what I've learned through that is it really is it's because of my fears and because I haven't paid attention to those fears, the anxiety just takes off. So how does that tie into this? To me, it's like it's is now, and for instance, like when I walked over a bridge a couple days ago that just a month ago scared the heck out of me. It was like I was enjoying the bridge and then the water running underneath the bridge and the plants. And I look forward to seeing that where I'd not done that before, where I'd have anxiety knowing there's a bridge. Now there's peace knowing that there's so much of the miraculous happening underneath that bridge.
Well, you better get ready, Tony. There's a lot of bridges in Brooklyn, okay?
Yeah. Yes, yes, there is.
All right. Anything else?
We'll just right out the gate. The virtue of hope to suffer wisely, calmly, and generously. So that kind of seems like a bunch of words that don't necessarily go in the same sentence, but I'm willing to discuss it, I guess.
Oh, good. Because we're going to do that right now.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, that is a mouthful, isn't it? The
Yes.
virtue of hope, with great irony, is the fruit of a learned capacity to suffer wisely, calmly, and generously. The virtue of hope is the fruit of a learned capacity to suffer wisely, calmly, and generously. Okay. Um, One thing I wanted to point out as we jumped into especially this section, because he leaves a lot open to interpretation here. He makes that opening statement, and he's going to develop it a little bit, but not completely. There's no teacher's edition to this. I just want you to know that. So I'm doing my best to interpret, based on my understanding of contemplation and what I know of Richard Rohr. But it's, in no way going to be definitive. So, we'll talk about it. I'll give you, what my best guess and what I'm convinced of. But just kind of remember that, we're all trying to walk through this together and interpret what's going on. And I thought in this first paragraph especially, it sounds kind of proverbial, you know? in the sense that there's almost three little proverbial statements, little short sentences that kind of loosely connect, but not fully. I mean, we've got the virtue of hope with great irony as the fruit of a learned capacity to suffer wisely, calmly, and generously. The ego demands successes to survive. The soul needs only meaning to thrive. Somehow hope provides its own kind of meaning in a most mysterious way. It's almost like three fortunes out of the cookie, and we're going to throw them into the same paragraph there. They do, I think, connect, but we're going to have to tease it out a little bit, I believe. Um, One of the things that I wanted to do was maybe let's go back to the paragraph right above, the last paragraph of the previous section, which was necessary suffering. He says, it seems there is a cruciform shape to reality with cross purposes, paradoxes, and conflicting intentions everywhere. Jesus hangs right there amid them, not even perfectly balancing them, but just holding them. This deserves a major wow because mere philosophy or even proper theology would never have come to this conclusion. Okay, so he's kind of painting this image of Jesus hanging on the cross that is right in the midst of these cross purposes, paradoxes, and conflicting intentions. The cross doesn't resolve those, but Jesus holds them in that moment of suffering, doesn't succumb to them, doesn't flop down to one side or another, doesn't blame anyone, doesn't get angry, bitter, vindictive in that moment. He never loses his sense of presence, or he does for a moment, right? God, my God, my God, why have you abandoned me? But then he circles back around again and reconnects. He doesn't lose his sense of oneness with even those who are crucifying him and mocking him and torturing him. He's just holding that space, holding that moment. And this is what he talks about as a wow, because mere philosophy or even proper theology would never have come to this conclusion. The theology of the rabbis that Jesus came against so often in the Gospels was because they didn't come to the same kind of conclusion. They didn't look at forgiveness the way he did. They didn't look at love of the enemy, certainly, the way he did. And so there were these big differences between Jesus' view of love and Jesus' view of relationship and what was in his own religion, in his own culture. He's not going to be able to resolve that, but he's just hanging there amidst them and holding the space. I think it's a picture of what we're talking about when we talk about suffering wisely, calmly, and generously. Generously seems to be an odd word to put in there, right?
Mhm.
Suffering wisely, calmly, and generously. But the suffering is holding that place. Remember the pain that we talked about is the rent we pay as human beings but suffering is to some extent optional. We define suffering as the resistance to the pain. The pain is just, it's going to come, it's going to go. There's nothing we can do about it as humans. Our resistance to that pain is what we're defining as suffering. But everybody resists pain, especially at the beginning. But if we can hold on to that resistance long enough, we can get through it until we don't resist it anymore. It's just like change. Change doesn't hurt, even though everybody fears change to a certain degree. But resistance to change, of course, is excruciating. So can we just hold on to that? Not make decisions based on it, not make conclusions based on it, but hold that space as we move through it and get to the other side. It's just like the paradox that we've talked about off and on, right? The paradox gives us these conflicting poles. And I mean, what we're going to want to do, because it throws us into a place of real discomfort, if not trauma. And we want to resolve the paradox. We want to resolve the seeming contradiction. But if we flop down to one side or another and just make a choice, then that paradox can no longer teach us anything. It's holding on to the middle space between those conflicting poles and moving through it, not trying to resolve it, because the major paradoxes of life can't be resolved. There is not that kind of certainty in life. But if we can hold on to it, then something happens. And so this is what I think he's saying in that first sentence, that the virtue of hope, ironically, right, is the fruit. It's what's going to come to us after we learn how to suffer wisely, calmly, and generously, after we learn how not to avoid it, not to just knee-jerk label it as evil, try to pray it away, count it as being victimized and blaming others for it. But if we can just stay with it, push through it, something is going to happen to us on the other side of that experience. And ironically, that's what eventually is going to give us the hope. That's going to make us hopeful. Because what suffering does as we push through it, it makes us more aware. It makes us more aware of who we are in relationship, how the world actually works in ways that we can't really explain or express. And it gives us a sense of meaning as well. And in that meaning comes the hope. I was thinking as I was reading this, I popped into mind is Brady's near-death experience. And of course Patricia's as well. But Brady's especially because he's so articulate about expressing it to us. But that holding that space and moving through it also gave him a sense of hope. That even in the midst of actually physically dying and going into this completely alien experience and realizing that there was no disconnect in the blackness. There was only connection and hope and a sense of being held and being cared for and being directed as well. And so as we move through the difficulties in life, if we are able to stay and hold that place as Jesus does on the cross, we're going to have a similar sort of experience on the other side of it, where we feel that connection and we can feel the hope that comes from it. Is that starting to make sense? I know I threw a lot of words at that.
I think it is, Dave, what you're saying. And I still struggle a little bit with the word generously, but I'm just picking it apart at this point. But it makes sense trying to stay with it and breathe through it and go through it calmly and somewhat, what's the other word, wisely. Generously, I don't know what that means exactly, but maybe just being generous with yourself, or I don't know exactly what that part means, but it makes sense, I think, what you're saying. Not easy.
No, it's not
It
easy at
doesn't
all.
feel good, probably.
I think maybe the generously can refer to the way that we still look at others. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. There's Jesus from the cross, right? And so we're going to be generous in the sense that we're going to continue to give people the benefit of the doubt. We're going to continue to identify with people rather than to see them as wholly other and at blame for the things that are
Mhm.
befalling us. I think generous can be applied
Mhm.
in that way. The calmly part, I mean, when you're in the midst of trauma, it's pretty hard to be calm, but in the next breath, just like Jesus did. This is why it's so beautiful the way the Gospels are written. Jesus loses it in the garden, right? Take this cup away from me. He prays that the suffering and the pain can be avoided. But after a night of sweating blood, he comes back, and it was all night. The Gospels make it sound like it was 15 minutes, but I'm sure it was all night long that he was there until he could finally say, "Not my will, but yours be done." On the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? And yet, by the end, he can say, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." So we see even Jesus, being taken out at the knees by the traumas, by the loss that he faces, by the suffering. But then he is able to hold it, not run from it, but hold it, and then pass through it. And then it becomes something else on the other side. And, you know, I think, Kathy, I think about Lenny all the time, the suffering that we went through at his death. And yet, look what it has brought us, because we held it. We didn't try to avoid it. We didn't, you know, think of it as just this evil, but we were looking for something on the other side of it that made sense of it. And of course, it brought you to us and this relationship. And so there's been this good that has come out of it, and an understanding. It forced us to think about suicide. It forced us to think about, what does that really mean? It forced us to look at ourselves and say, gosh, whenever someone dies, especially if they take their own life, immediately the tapes start playing of, what could I have done? What should I have done? What more could I have done? And you go through the laundry list of all that. You start replaying all of your last encounters with the person. And through that, you get a different sense of relationships and how they should be played out, and how it's so important for us to connect, when we have the chance to connect, because you never know when's going to be your last connection. And so a lot has come from that suffering. And I think about that. And if I'm sure you all can think about times of your own suffering, and whether you learned from it or not. But if you did learn something for it, if you can look back at any of the really difficult times in your life and have some sense of gratitude for them, you know, not that you'd want to relive them, but at least you can be grateful because they did move your life in a new direction. Then you've had some sense, I think, about what Rohr is talking about here.
Yeah. For generously, I might consider the word grace almost in a sense too, but it's the same thing, same thought.
Mm-hmm. Just don't like generously, huh?
You don't know, just money in the sentence, that's all. But it's semantics, no big deal.
All right.
I see where Rohr's going.
Yeah. Okay, so then, right after that, the ego demands successes to survive. The soul needs only meaning to thrive. You know, I mean, we're back to kind of reward and punishment, I suppose, to a certain degree. The ego is looking at performance. The ego is looking at acquisition. The ego is looking at all those external and material, I suppose, successes and advantages in order to feel fulfilled. But the soul needs only meaning in order to thrive. It's an internal experience that gives us that sense of meaning. And so you wouldn't consider any of the traumas of your life, any of the suffering of your life as a success, would you? And yet, from a soul point of view, if it takes you to a place of meaning, it can actually cause you to thrive, expand you, take you to deeper places of connection and understanding. That spiritual awakening that we throw around, but I would define as the realization of the oneness of everything. I mean, that's the awakening. We're awakening to the fact that everything is one, everything is connected, everything is equally loved because it's equally connected. It's all one thing. And that realization is a spiritual awakening. And great suffering can take us there. It can pull away the curtain of the egoic mind's illusion of separation and show us how we really do connect to one another. It's painful. It hurts. Nobody wants to go through it. We'll resist it at first. But if we'll hold it, then something happens.
Oh, hey, Kathy, real
Go ahead.
fast. Generous. The second meaning of generous, free from meanness or smallness of mind, magnanimous. Maybe an easier way to accept it.
Yeah, interesting. Those words resonate a little more. Yeah, thanks.
Sure.
Somehow hope provides its own kind of meaning in a most mysterious way. So it's kind of a circular path here, right? Let me start with pain. Pain causes the resistance or the suffering. But if we'll hold on to the suffering, we can go through to hope, which creates the meaning, which then will take us back to pain in the next trauma that comes down the pike. So again, there's that circular path, always a circular path, the hero's journey. And the hero's journey always starts with the wounding, always starts with the pain, the suffering. That is the impetus strong enough to actually kick off the next journey, to move us from the place of comfort, of familiarity, out into the unknown again, into the disturbing and disorienting places, and go through another journey. The gospel gives our suffering both personal and cosmic meaning by connecting our pain to the pain of others, and finally by connecting us to the very pain of God. So why does connecting our pain to others' pain and ultimately God's pain, how does that give it meaning? Does that sound counterintuitive to anybody?
Well, unless we're going with misery loves company.
I'm hearing empathy.
I'm sorry, Randy, what did you say?
Well, in that statement, I'm hearing empathy is
Empathy?
is being spoken. And of course, I really don't know what God's pain is. Again, if we're going to build on that whole God is everything, everywhere, everyone, then God's pain is humanity's pain. So, and therefore, again, if you, Scott, Sarah, George, Frank, whoever it is sharing something that leads me to say me too, whether I utter those words but I have that I don't know, looking more for similarities than differences. Nor am I thinking, oh, that poor soul, that poor pitiful soul. No, I'm in their shoes. That empathy. That's what I do.
Okay. I think, this is for me, it comes back to something that we've talked about in here so many times. What is our real purpose here in life as human beings? And is that purpose universal, or is it specific to each one of us? Back to the what and the how, right?
When you say universal, you're saying that it's every human's purpose?
Every human's purpose. Is there a universal purpose for humanity, or is our purpose specific? Is it a what or is it a how? I think you're going to know my answer. What I'm convinced of is that it's a how and not a what. The things that we do in life, whatever they happen to be, an architect or a mailman, those are our own choices, and that is what we purpose to do, but it's not our deepest purpose. The deepest purpose is the task within the task, to use another of Rohr's phrases, and that always has to do with connection. Whatever we're doing, the most meaningful it's ever going to be is when we simultaneously realize both that surface task and the task within the task, that whatever we're doing is connecting us somehow to other people. Either the work itself is connecting us, or the fact that we're in proximity to other people as we're doing the work is connecting us. But it's the connection that feels meaningful. And the only time we really feel meaningful as human beings is when we're connected. and connecting. That's why, when we get into depression or we get into some kind of addiction, the first thing it does is take us out of connection. And the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, has been pointed out. The opposite of addiction is connection. And there was that interesting study done by returning vets from Vietnam. Heroin use was rampant in Vietnam among U.S. servicemen. And so the thought was when they came home, they'd be running around as raging heroin addicts. But as soon as they came home, most of them dropped the heroin usage because they reconnected. They were in an artificial situation of such disconnect and separation and atrocity that they needed the heroin to self-medicate. But once they came back into connection with families and community, they didn't need it anymore. So I think what this is telling us is the gospel gives our suffering both personal and cosmic meaning by connecting our pain to the pain of others. I mean, nothing is going to give us meaning as much, even in our pain and in our suffering, um, as connecting it to somebody else, either to their pain or to their welfare. There's that great story of Viktor Frankl, and I know I've told it in here before, for Man's Search for Meaning, where the elderly gentleman comes into his psychiatrist office in Vienna and needs help from him. And he's a physician himself, this older man, and his wife died several years before, and he just can't get over it. He can't get through the grief. And so he's got this prolonged grief and he's suffering and he doesn't know what to do. And so Victor listens to him for a while and then he finally says, if you had died first, what would it have been like for your wife? Oh, it would have been terrible. She wouldn't have done what to do. It would have been so difficult for her. So he says, in a way, your suffering, your pain right now relieved her of having to go through the pain. And he thinks about it for a second, gets up, puts on his hat and coat, and leaves and never comes back. You know? If we can connect our pain to others in one way or another, that gives us meaning. And that meaning is hopeful. And I think that's what he's getting at here. And the gospel, through especially the cross, if we understand the cross rightly, and not as propitiation, not as simply appeasing an angry God, then we can start to see how all of that connects. Jesus tells us if you want to be my follower, you need to be willing to pick up your cross, right? And how do we define cross? As the voluntary and necessary suffering that is, I suppose, endured for the sake of, and maybe as a result of spiritual awakening. Are you willing to pick up your cross daily, deny yourself, and follow? And so there's that understanding that the suffering is needed. Now we can take that too far, the way Western Christians did, to the point that in medieval European times, people are self-flagellating and wearing cilices and keeping themselves in constant pain because they're trying to emulate the suffering and the scars of Christ. But that's obviously not the point. The suffering will come to us. How do we deal with it? Can we hold it the way he did? Can we see it as connected to those images in the scriptures, so on and so forth? And then this idea of connecting this to the pain of God. Did you ever think of God as suffering? Do you? Do any of you think of God as suffering?
I love the analogy of, well, it's not the analogy, but the example of God in the Garden of Gethsemane. I can't talk tonight, but yeah, like just being able to connect it, knowing that God himself was feeling this intense amount of anxiety, and uh just, at that moment in the cross when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Um, the humanity in that is just my ability to connect and feel at one with the divine is it just changes everything for me. I feel so much more connected in that way when I think about that. And I like in pain itself, I mean, is one of those things that we need more than anything to feel that connection because when, a lot of times when we're in pain, we're like, oh, why me? I'm the only one. And I feel so separated and so alone. But when we understand that everyone feels pain and God, that's when like that realization of connection and oneness allows us to get through that suffering and to come out on the other side with the hope.
Mhm. So
I
oh, go ahead, Ellen.
yeah, I have a hard time seeing God as suffering because Jesus, the man in the form of man, yes, there is that suffering, but as man, but God as God. To me, I don't even see a body. It's ethereal. It's I don't know. Like he's too high up there to have suffering. He can understand my suffering, have compassion for it, but does he feel it? I don't know.
You
I
took the
think
words right out of my mouth. I was gonna say the same thing, Ellen. It's one thing to see Jesus as a human suffering and realize, okay, we equate him with God. We see him suffering as a human. But what about Father God? What about Spirit God? Does that change the equation? Can we
Yeah.
conceive of the creator of the cosmos also suffering in some way? Yeah, I've also, thought about, can we conceive of the creator of the cosmos as washing our feet, as actually being our servant, as being that humble and unassuming as Jesus was portraying. He said, "This is the Father, what you see me doing. I don't do anything except what the Father does through me." To think of the God, the Alpha and the Omega, being that servile. I mean, that's just mind-blowing, um, based on the way that we normally think of and image God. But the same thing here now with this suffering. And yet, if Jesus is telling us truly, he said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And we see him suffering. We see him brought to tears by the compassion he feels for those who are suffering around him. Um, are we not supposed to understand Spirit God in the same way?
Yeah, this changes the question, or the doesn't change the question, but it does make me think of a different answer a few weeks ago when I asked, did God see Jesus dying on the cross as a tragedy? Right. Based on this, the answer to me would be yes.
Mhm. And yet it's so easy for us to think of, well, God sees everything, right? The beginning from the end. And so God could take this very stoic attitude because God knows where all this is going. And so these intermediate moments that are so tragic in and of themselves, he somehow transcends. Maybe not. I mean, there's no definitive way to know here,
No,
but it is intriguing. And if, what Jesus is telling us in terms of showing us the Father's nature, in terms of the way the Father loves, well, how about the way the Father hurts? Is that also not valid? I mean, you're all going to have to come with what you can become convinced of. And of course, these kinds of speculations, because they are speculations, are only going to be as important as they help us along our spiritual journey toward that awakening we're talking about. That's why I'm such a nut and a stickler about the Father's love, because once we let go of that degreeless and indiscriminate love, the path toward um, the spiritual awakening, that true realization of oneness in our lives becomes almost nil. There's that path, but that path leads through these concepts that Jesus is trying so hard to get across to us. And so if we lose those, and if we succumb to what we think rationally the passage means when it looks like reward and punishment, then we've already shelved ourselves off from being able to really thread the needle and get through to the kingdom. So it's these are important if they're helping you. If they're not, if they're just confusing, you will put them on the shelf. It's not like you're going to need, or you're going to, first of all, come to any certainty about them, but you can embrace them in yourself if it's helping you. If it's not, then use a different paradigm. But it's obvious where Rohr is coming from, and it's intriguing for us to also consider it. Yeah.
Dave, I was just thinking that we've had many conversations before in this group too about, does God pull the puppet strings and hold the puppet strings? Is he the all seer and knower of everything that happens to us? There's some people that believe that, and then there's others who don't. A God like that who pulls puppet strings, I would say, probably doesn't have much room for suffering if they're calling all the shots anyway. But on the other hand, the way you talk about it, if God is there and loving us and there for us to love as openly as can be, and we don't respond in a way, that could be a suffering of God, because he's not, he's sad because maybe we're not giving him the time of day, or we're skirting his love, or we don't trust it or whatever. So maybe that's a kind of suffering that maybe he goes through. I don't know. Unrequited love, right?
Yeah, I can totally get
Does he get
behind
his
that.
feelings hurt? I don't know.
I'm sad right now that Jerry's not here. I'm sad
Mm.
that Beth and Brady aren't here. And they just texted me back, and Beth had a back procedure this evening, so today, so they're recovering from that. But yeah, you throw a party, you want the people to show up. I mean, right? And if they don't, that's hard to take. How many times did Jesus use the king's parable, right? The story of the wedding feast. And the king throws the wedding feast and sends out the invitations, and nobody comes, right? I think there's something to look at in there. I think he's giving us an insight because everybody knows what it's like to invite someone who doesn't come. It hurts, right? And then he sends it as, all right, if the people that my original invitees won't come, then go out and invite everybody else you see. Whether they're living in the under an overpass, it doesn't really matter. Just bring them on. But that idea of yeah, God is throwing a party here. Are we going to show up? God gave us free will so that we could truly choose to come to the party, but he has to risk us not coming if he's going to give us the freedom that love requires. And does that hurt?
Interesting as I was listening to you, Kathy, and then listening to Dave's response, and maybe others have caught it, but you're all talking about connecting. Like all of a sudden, if God is suffering, connecting means a whole lot more with God. If he's doing the puppet strings, why would I want to connect?
Mhm. Yeah. Why is it necessary, right?
Why
Yeah.
is it necessary?
Mhm.
Well, maybe if it isn't so much that it's the puppet strings involved, it's just what if the whole thing is so there are some spiritual disciplines I've heard about the premise of God manifesting in this reality is to have something comparative to perfect love. There must be a hot to know that there is a cold, that type of premise, which is logical to me, but of course there's no real logic in love. But again, building upon that hypothesis that God's spirit is in this realm for the purpose of coming back, that all of our lives are about coming back to the Father, to the God, and in the suffering of the separation. But it's inevitable. Again, my hypothesis is I believe in reincarnation. Eventually, now may take 100,000 lifetimes, but we all come back to the Father. We all come back to the garden. We all come home. So, in regards to, is there a puppet master? No, built in the whole system is free will for the same reason as Dave mentioned before. There must be free will for there to be true love. But ultimately, we're okay. The Father is with us. Again, my spiritual belief is God is everywhere, everywhen. God is always with me. I can calm down all my neuroses and biases and all that kind of stuff that causes me to disconnect from the moment. I can have an okayness that, yeah, maybe, I don't know, there's a lot more suffering in store in the process that I got to go through the meat grinder a few more times, but eventually it's just part of the deal. Does that make, again, I feel like I'm rambling when I get into this stuff. But did
Doing
any,
all right,
I
Randy.
don't expect anybody to agree with me, but was there any sense, any logic that was there threads in the stuff I was spewing
What do you mean by reincarnation?
that energy cannot be destroyed?
Yeah, but you're not thinking like you come back as somebody else, right?
I could come back in some other shape or form or in another plane, but the energy that is my
So you
life.
somebody different.
Well,
You're
there's
not
all kinds of.
you were in the
I
form
don't.
of-
This is the mystery of it. Again, this is built around what I started in the explanation or the hypothesis, I should say, more accurately. I don't know in regards to do I go off into another plane of existence in a multiverse where now all of a sudden I look like something from a hallucination or Alice in Wonderland's, kind of thing. Do I come back as, I don't know, Joan of Arc, 2055. That part I don't understand. It's again, it's built upon the basic, again, belief system that we do come back to the Father. And there has to be a process for that to happen. I don't believe in vicarious atonement. I do not believe just in me saying, Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and he died for my sins, that all of a sudden that theosis occurs, that sanctification occurs. I have to go through the mill as many times as it takes for me to have a Christ-like mind. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
And-
yeah, I mean, you got to go through it. It's a journey. It's a process.
Yeah.
But I don't. I mean, when you die, this in the physical realm, you're still going to know who you are. Why would we go through all this if not? I mean, it's a process of learning, and I think it comes back to connection. It's like Dave said. I agree. It all comes back because without connection, what's the whole point? It's like if you're on your deathbed, for example, right, and you were a successful businessman, and you got your family and friends around you, and you're 86 here in a minute. You're not going to be talking about all the deals that you made and how great business. You're going to talk about the relationships. That's the connection, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't. I mean, when we die, I mean it's we're not really gonna. We're just going to die physically. I don't. I mean, it's like what was it to be absent from the body, to be present with the Lord, right? So we're going to always have that connection with God. I don't think we're going to know who we are. We're not going to come back as something else because we didn't learn something.
So I knew as soon as Randy said reincarnation that we had a possible bunny trail here. So yeah, and from an evangelical point of view, reincarnation is a big no-no. But truthfully, for Jews, excuse me, for Jews, since they don't have definitive doctrine about the afterlife, they can believe whatever they want to believe, including reincarnation. And once again, these are the people who wrote our scriptures. So
I'll just say, Randy, one of the things that you said just makes me feel at ease when you just said, whatever happens, we just come back to the garden with God. And that sits well with me. Whatever roundabout way we get there. I
And
like
that's
that.
kind of part of the fun. At least it helps me. It is like if it was, I don't know, if it was too easy. I mean, again, it's just like, okay, you say the right words at the right time and, you interpret the scriptures correctly and stuff. And all of a sudden, I don't know, you're all good kind of stuff. Well, at first glance, at least for me, I thought that was great. But to understand this human experience of we're tying this back in is the suffering. The suffering is an overcoming and the trusting that God is with us. As I shared with at the beginning of the call, we're going through something that Sue's really, really stressed over at first. But then when I, did a few things about clarifying the situation, but reminding her to trust in God, we're okay. Okay. If that, again, so And again, all that's real is right now. No one's, knocking on our door saying get out in 72 hours kind of stuff. So it is silly to worry, but also to know that I've gone through all kinds of stuff that I thought was just, man, game over. This is the demise. There's no way I'm pulling out of this tailspin. And well, obviously, since I'm talking with you and stuff, I managed to pull out of the tailspin. So again, it's I have a trust, not even necessarily a faith. I have no idea what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, let alone the next 5 days, 5 years, or whatever. But I do have this knowing beyond empirical evidence that the Spirit of God is with me and with everyone else, and that works. That works for me to have an equanimity when things happen, that I can remain calm and realize I better call my real estate agent right now. I better call the landlord right now. Just little simple things that may not necessarily be considered holy, spiritual, but I was calm. Sue's hair was on fire. Mine wasn't. And some people, if you're an atheist humanist and stuff, you could just kind of say, well, dude, you're just level-headed. And that's up to each and every one of us to find a definition of meaning in each moment. But yeah, now again, maybe I'm totally wrong. And when I draw my last breath, yeah, I get the express elevator. Boom. I'm back home with God, and yeah, we're partying. We got
That's our ultimate goal, brother. Is to be with the Lord.
All right. So we're not
So
going to
anyway,
solve.
yeah, obviously I could go on for this. Excuse me.
But we need to get back on track here. But we're not going to solve whether God suffers, and we're not going to solve whether reincarnation is, an actual experience that we're going to have. And it doesn't matter that we do. And I think that's the bottom line. One of the beautiful things about holding on to the stake in the ground at the Father's love is that we realize that God will never damn us for a wrong thought in our heads. That is not the criteria that God uses to accept or reject us. In fact, the truth of the matter is that God doesn't reject anyone. That doesn't mean there is no hell, doesn't mean that love wins, it doesn't mean that everyone is reconciled to God, because we have free will. But God is oneness. God is love. So there is no rejection in God. There is only forgiveness. There is only oneness. And if we hang on to that, then, as we look for a personal theology that can bring us through the journey that we're trying to take to an awakening, that's okay. And if we find out at some point that it doesn't seem to work anymore because the next trauma has blown it out, then we have to be courageous enough to start over, remake the meaning on the other side of that. That's what we talk about, holding the suffering, holding the line through that, so that on the other side, we can create the new expansive paradigm that is going to take us through the next leg of the journey, and then the one after that. And that's how this works. It works in stages that way, in circular journeys. We only have a few minutes left, but let's do a little bit more. Any form of contemplation is a gradual sinking into this divine fullness where hope lives. So contemplation helps us to go there, right? By practicing solitude and silence and stillness and simplicity, we are closing off all of the distractions. We are pulling the curtain back on the mind's illusions and imagines certainties in order to be able to move into this place. So, we talk about hitting bottom in terms of recovery, but there's also the concept of bringing the bottom up to us. It's a kinder and gentler way to get to the same place. That's what contemplation does. It brings the bottom up to us. It brings the abyss up to us. It brings the precipice closer because we're actually practicing. Contemplation is living in a unified field that produces in people a deep, largely non-rational, and yet calmly certain hope, which is always a surprise. It's always a surprise. So contemplation is moving into that oneness. Why? Because we're stepping aside from the only thing that can conceive of separation, our minds. That's what contemplation is about. Stepping outside the only apparatus that is keeping us separated in sin, right? Because sin is separation from everyone and everything else, including God's presence. Contemplation is living in a unified field that produces in people a deep, largely non-rational, you're not going to be able to explain it, not even to yourself, and yet calmly certain hope. When you feel that connection, just like Brady did in his near-death experience, you feel that connection, that caring, and caring for. That's the hope, and it's always a surprise. It's not a revelation. Don't think of what you're going to get in contemplation as a revelation. The clouds part, the straight rays of the sun shine down and fill you with some sort of intellectual understanding, some sort of epiphany. It doesn't work that way. You go into your contemplative practice, and it's most often seems like nothing happens, except you do feel that calmness, you do feel that connection. Incrementally, as you keep showing up day after day, there is the realization, you know, that there is that oneness. Every time that you step outside your mind, you're going to find that oneness and that connection again. And that becomes a conviction. That becomes a knowing of who God is. But it kind of, I remember Jeff Jones, who was our co-founder and a recovering heroin addict. He stood up in church one Sunday after I did my message because he would close the services. And he said, Dave's messages are kind of like creeper pot. And I don't know if any of you know what creeper pot is, but it's marijuana that you smoke or you use, and the high comes later. And he said, they're kind of like, you said, you think about them for a while. They don't make any sense when you're hearing them. And then you think about them for a while and it slowly. So contemplation is kind of like that. You know, I'd never heard my message compared to pot before, but that was kind of cool. But that's the way contemplation works. It creeps up on you. It's this incremental realization. And it's a different kind of experience than an intellectual revelation. That's a whole different kind of encounter. And that's not what we're looking for in contemplation. A life of inner union, a contemplative life, is practicing for heaven now. How many times have I said, and I actually wrote it at one point, heaven is waiting for us, but we don't have to wait for heaven. Heaven is always now, always now, whether it's now, or whether it's then now after we die, but it's still just now. So if we can't conceive of ourselves as one with, which is what heaven is, then we're not going to be ready for heaven when it's presented to us. We're going to need Gehenna. We're going to need purgatory. We're going to need reincarnation. We're going to need something to finally get us to the place that we can accept oneness now. God allows us to bring on earth what is in heaven. Every time we can allow, receive, and forgive the conflicts of the moment and sit in some degree of contentment despite all the warring evidence. That's it, right? We're bringing on earth what is in heaven when we can let go of whatever we are thinking about and however we are judging the moment that we're occupying at the time. Basically, it's about acceptance, right? It's about being unoffendable. It's about allowing the moment to flow over us and through us and be completely immersed and grateful for and realize that the moment is enough. All of those things. That's bringing heaven on earth. God alone, it seems to me, can hold together all the seeming opposites and contradictions of life. In and with God, we can actually do the same, but we are not the doer. And that, of course, reminded me of the first 3 steps of AA. To admit that we're powerless, to come to believe that there is a power greater than ourselves that can and will restore our lives to sanity, and then to give our life and our will over to that power. Those 3 steps is what I think he means, that we're not the doer. We can hitch our wagon to the doer. And so in and through God, we can experience and hold together all those seeming opposites and contradictions the way Jesus did on the cross. But it is difficult. And we're not the doer. We don't do it on our own. We always do it in connection with, there's that word again, in community with, in solidarity with God's Spirit. And I didn't cough through that last 10 minutes.
I don't know, Dave. I'm getting the high now. It's not coming later.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Creeper pot. Now you know what that means.
Creeper pot.
Never heard of that before.
Oh,
I actually hadn't heard it until he said it that day, some 15, 16 years ago. But we all got a kick out of it. You
are
know?
we gonna need the video editing after this creeper pot thing?
Absolutely not. We're going to wear our oddities proudly. We are non-orthodox in many ways. It's okay. We're a recovery community. We can talk this way, right?
We're still G-rated so far.
I like Randy's idea of reincarnation, because with that premise, we're going to be something else or someone else in the future after we did, and we were something else and somewhere else before that. We were something. And I'm big in recycling, so I'm glad to be recycled. But see, this is the thing too that is mind-boggling for me. There's billions of people here now. I don't know how many billions. But before us, there were whatever, billions. And in the future, there's billions and billions. That means infinitely, there's infinite number of souls, or is that, or there is an infinite? We do get recycled. Well, right? So we don't know. It's just an idea.
I know, and we can chase our tail on those kind of ideas from here till kingdom come. You know, there's no way to resolve that kind of stuff. Obviously, the egoic identity, the one that we normally identify with, and that we all know each other by, right? Our names and our appearance and our character and all of that. You know, does that just end at the headstone? I mean, our deeper selves is what we're trying to experience in contemplative practice, which is underneath all of that. You know, that more universal identity, that deeper identity, which, how much does it have to do with our egoic identity? These are all questions that can't be answered. You know, Eastern religions understand the consciousness is returning like a drop to the ocean after death. You know, we don't retain our own individual sense of self. I don't like that idea. That bothers me, you know, but it's possible. Everything is possible. And the truth of the matter is we're not going to know. And that's why we fear death, right? Until you practice it in contemplation. You experience a little death and you realize every time I let go of everything, every time I let go of everything that is going to be taken from me at death, all I feel is connection and peace and calm and a sense of being held and cared for. What is there to fear in that? Just like Brady's near-death experience. Even in the blackness, there was nothing to fear in the darkness. There was still connection, presence, caring, empathy. The only way that we're going to lose our fear of death is to experience that more and more and more. And even then, I think it's going to give us pause when it's right in front of us. But it gets better. So contemplation is good on all those levels. Contemplation, since it can help alleviate our fear of death, can help us to really embrace life much more strongly than we can if we're fearing death. And so that's of course is what this is all about. How do we live the abundant life that Jesus is trying to show us? No, this is how we do it. This is his way. His way is the contemplative way. So, all right, we better stop there.
Well, plus, I'm sorry, one thing, because there's no rewards and punishment, right? So Randy, you and I, we will not come back as cockroaches. So that's good.
What's wrong with a cockroach?
If I'm a cockroach, I am a cockroach. If I am a pachyderm, I'm a pachyderm. I'm trying to focus more on where my feet are right now.
Hmm. Hey, we never got Brooklyn tonight. That's different.
No.
Have to check in on William, make sure he's okay. Yeah. But yeah, that's unusual. All right, Scotty.
Thank you, Father God, for this time and the exchanging of these ideas and concepts, and encourage us to be more open and just more capable of giving it a shot with regards to understanding things and not being so wrapped up in what we believe we should be like, or how we should act, or what we can lean into. And there's so much to learn, Lord. It's just the more we come to these classes and spend time reading and encouraging each other, our mind space opens up and we find more of you. So, Lord, we thank you for this time together and for the love that we're able to share with each other. And we just love you, Lord. It's in your precious and holy name, Lord Jesus, that we give our thanks and we say our prayers and say our amens. Amen.
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 Thanks, everybody. Another good discussion.
Bye all.
We'll see you Sunday.
Thank
See you guys Sunday.
Feel better, everybody. Good luck,
Yeah.
Randy.
Thanks, Kathy. You too.
Bye, Kathy.
Thanks all.
Bye, guys.
Good night, good night, good night.
Good night.
Good night,
Good night,
Frank.
George.
Good night, George.
Good night, Dave.
Good night,
Good night,
Jordana, Scotty.
You
Good
guys.
night, John Boy.
All right.
Good night,
See you
Martha.
Sunday, Jordana.
All right. Bye.
All right. Hopefully you too, Franctified.